May 4th, 2025. The wind screamed across Makalu's Camp 2. Inside a tent sat Alexander Pancoe, a man who had already beaten death once. At 19, he survived a brain tumor. At 35, he stood on Everest, climbing for the same hospital that once saved him. But what if the most dangerous mountain isn't made of ice and stone? What if it's the one growing inside you? He wasn't supposed to be here, not after cancer, not after everything. But for Alexander, climbing wasn't about reaching the top. It was about living an adventure while saving lives. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the same passion that saved him also took his life. Welcome to the Extreme Edge. It started with unexplainable headaches, the kind that hurt enough to make a young man pause in the middle of laughter and wonder why the room was spinning. But 19-year-old Alexander Pancoe's life was like any other college sophomore's. Classes, friends, and late-night partying were probably the order of his days. There was no reason to think anything was wrong until the pain refused to leave. When Alexander's symptoms didn't get better, he knew he had to visit the hospital. In his case, the Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago. Soon, his test results revealed something was growing in his head. Alexander had a brain tumor. The news hit harder than any mountain storm he would ever face. College had just started, and there was a possibility of his tumor being cancerous. Would he get to finish college, travel the world, get married? However, Alexander soon realized he didn't have to worry because the tumor was not cancerous and it was operable. The surgery and treatment were successful, and slowly, he began to recover. Eventually, he returned to normal life, and over the next 9 years, Alexander built the kind of life most people would envy. He graduated from college and secured a stable and well-paying job in finance. Yet, deep down, something felt missing. His days felt too predictable, too comfortable, and he soon began to wonder if that was all there was to life. Alexander began to crave something that could make him feel alive again. That's when he decided to take a safari trip in Africa. It was his first time there, and as he watched animals live in their natural homes, something shifted in him. Everything around him was alive, and for the first time since his illness, so was he. And that must be when the thought hit him. What if he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro? Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be part of the Extreme community, get early access to our videos and exclusive polls, come join us on Patreon. Kilimanjaro stands as the highest peak in Africa at over 19,000 feet of ice, stone, and thin air. It sounded impossible, and that was exactly why Alexander wanted to do it. But deciding to climb it was one thing, preparing for it was another. At the time, Alexander wasn't exactly in top physical shape. Working behind a desk in a busy American city had dulled his endurance. So, he started small. Every day, Alexander would go on runs, pushing himself a little further each time. Soon, he started hiking the 14,000-foot-high mountains in Colorado. Everything was new to him. Yet, Alexander didn't stop training for his big adventure. However, he sometimes doubted himself. Could he really do this? Could a man who once lay in a hospital bed, uncertain if he'd survive, really climb one of the tallest mountains in the world? But that was exactly the point. It didn't matter whether he reached the top or not. What mattered more was that he tried. And so, in 2016, Alexander flew back to Africa and began the ascent up Kilimanjaro. Can you imagine being Alexander's work buddy and watching him transform to an adventurous climber in Africa? Kilimanjaro was nothing like the mountains in Colorado. Those had been practice runs and climbs on 14,000 feet high mountains. But this was 19,000 feet of shifting terrain, from humid rainforest to dry, open plains, and finally, the glaciered summit where the air thinned until each breath felt borrowed. From the first day, Alexander understood why people called it a challenge of endurance more than strength. The trail was long and deceptive. At lower altitudes, it almost felt like a long, easy hike with strangers who would soon become companions. But as he climbed higher, the comfort began to slip away. The air cooled, and falling asleep became difficult. Alexander wasn't an experienced climber. This was his first real encounter with altitude, and his body reacted in all the predictable ways. The dull, throbbing headaches returned, except they weren't like the ones that had sent him to the hospital many years ago. Sometimes he got nauseous, and breathing felt like pulling air through a straw. But every time he stopped to rest, he remembered the days he'd spent confined to a hospital bed, wondering if his body would ever feel strong again. He would remember the repetitive life he lived doing his desk job. Compared to that, this pain meant he was truly living. The summit push began before dawn on the final day. Everyone moved in silence, conserving energy, the light from their headlamps forming a slow, winding trail across the dark slope. The air was so thin that each step felt like lifting something far heavier than his own body. He didn't think about the summit anymore, he just focused on breathing and not stopping. When the first rays of sunlight appeared, he saw the wooden sign at Uhuru Peak. He had made it to the highest point in Africa. Alexander couldn't believe it. As he stood there watching the clouds float below his feet, the reality of what he had just achieved hit him. He had made it. For the first time in years, he felt completely alive and completely free. That moment changed everything. Standing there, Alexander realized this wasn't the end of his journey. It was the beginning. He had faced death at 19, but now he wanted to face life fully, fearlessly, and on his own terms. The thought of doing the Explorer's Grand Slam didn't come to Alexander overnight. It started as a simple fascination, a question that refused to leave his mind after Kilimanjaro. If one mountain could change his life, what could 7 do? Now, let me explain what the Explorer's Grand Slam is about. The challenge sounded almost mythical. Climb the highest peak on each of the 7 continents and ski the last degree to both the North and South Poles. Fewer than 100 people in history had ever done it, and none, as far as Alexander knew, had done it to honor the hospital that once saved their life. He began to study the challenge like his finance textbooks, as if studying for the biggest exam of his life. He needed to make the 7 summits. And then there were the poles, where temperatures could drop below minus 40 degrees, and where a single wrong move could leave a man buried in ice. Completing it wasn't a year's task. It was a 5-year plan of logistics and endurance. Each expedition demanded months of planning and physical conditioning. Aside from Alexander's individual drive to climb, there was something bigger he was risking his life for. He had a goal to raise $1 million for pediatric neuroscience research at Lurie Children's Hospital, one summit at a time. It was a mission larger than himself, and that gave it meaning. But one major setback stood out. To prepare for his expedition to Mount Everest, Alexander had planned to climb to Cho-Oyu. But first, he went on a solo training climb of Snowmass Mountain, one of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks. It wasn't his first time climbing one of the Colorado mountains, and he had gone for a speed ascent, carrying only minimal gear. But on his way back down, something devastating happened. His foot slipped, and a sharp rock tore deep into his leg, slicing his calf muscle clean in half, right to the bone. He was alone and bleeding high on the mountain. There was no one to call for help but himself. He managed to stop the bleeding and radio for rescue, but the situation was horrible. Hours later, a Black Hawk helicopter from Aspen Mountain Rescue and the Colorado High Altitude Army National Guard lifted him to safety. As they flew him to a hospital, Alexander's fears were probably not about whether he would climb again. It must have been about whether he would even keep his leg. Not only was he at a serious risk of an infection, there was also a chance that he would never walk normally again. But once again, Alexander was in luck. Miraculously, the nerve remained unaffected. 6 weeks later, Alexander was climbing Cho-Oyu in Tibet, defying all odds. Between 2016 and 2019, Alexander's climbs would take him across the frozen emptiness of Antarctica and into the death zone above 26,000 feet on Everest. On Vinson Massif in Antarctica, the challenge wasn't just the climb, but the environment itself. Even though the sun circled the sky, it offered no warmth. The cold felt solid, and the silence was broken only by the sound of his own footsteps across the ice. So Alexander pressed on, and only stopped when he stood on the peak. He had accomplished 7 goals by skiing to both poles and making 5 out of 7 summits. He just had to summit Everest and Denali to complete the Explorer's Grand Slam. The path to Everest led him first to the Himalayas, long before the final summit push. In October 2017, he joined an expedition to Island Peak. It was his first time in the Khumbu region of Nepal, surrounded by Everest, Lhotse, and Ama Dablam. Seeing Everest up close for the first time left him speechless, and reinforced his decision to climb the highest peak in the world. Later, he would tell others who dreamed of those peaks to first visit Nepal without the pressure of an expedition, to simply stand there, breathe, and lose yourself in the majesty of it all. When Alexander would eventually climb Everest in 2019, he did it for a very emotional cause. This time, he wasn't just climbing for himself or even for the Grand Slam. He was climbing for Serena Lewis, a 15-year-old girl he had met through the hospital who was battling her own medical complications. The Everest climb was a different beast altogether. His first major challenge was the Khumbu Icefall. Imagine a river of ice, but it's shattered into a chaotic maze of massive ice towers and bottomless cracks. These structures can collapse without warning, making it one of the most dangerous parts of the climb. After navigating that, he entered a silent, sun-baked valley, and then began the grueling climb up a steep, icy wall. With every step upward, the air became thinner until each breath felt like he was breathing through a thin straw. And then there's the death zone, above 26,000 feet, where his body was literally dying. Each step was a huge effort of will. His head hurt, and his lungs screamed for oxygen that wasn't there. If he exposed any skin, he would get severely frostbitten. Alexander was exhausted, yet, as he climbed, he held on to one thought: Serena. The thought of the little girl facing her own terrifying battle gave his own suffering a purpose. So he continued to climb through every challenge on the mountain. Eventually, Alexander made it to the top. He could barely believe what he'd done. For Serena, Alexander had done what would have been impossible only a decade ago. Alex, who once lay in hospital beds questioning his life, had now stood on top of the world and done it for something that mattered. On June 23, 2019, Alexander stood on Denali, completing the Grand Slam. By doing so, he became the 16th American and among about 70 people in the world to ever complete that challenge. He raised almost $500,000, a huge step towards his $1 million goal for the pediatric brain tumor program at Lurie Children's Hospital. By the time he returned home, he was not just a conqueror, but a changed person. And for Alexander, that journey had only just begun. By 2023, Alexander had already lived several lives in one body. He had gone from a 19-year-old brain tumor survivor to a man who had conquered the highest mountains on all 7 continents. He had raised money for the children's hospital that once saved him, gotten married, and become a father. For the first time, his world felt complete and grounded. But life, unpredictable as always, gave him another mountain to face. This time, it started with breathlessness. Alexander had joined a climb on Ama Dablam in Nepal, a beautiful yet technically difficult mountain. Somewhere along that climb, Alexander noticed he was unusually weak and short of breath. He had been through enough expeditions to know the difference between altitude fatigue and something deeper. So once he returned home, he made sure to see the doctors, hoping that once more, the problem wouldn't be life-threatening. But by the time his doctors ran some tests, they realized something gutting and too close to the cause he had been raising money for. Alexander was diagnosed with chronic myeloid leukemia. Even though it is treatable, this blood cancer would require lifelong management. Back when he had a brain tumor, Alexander was a teen, scared about all the things he might never get to do. But this time, he had traveled the world, found happiness and purpose. What would a man like that be scared of? Was it the fear of losing his independence as a climber and becoming dependent on his wife? Could it be the fear of not seeing his child grow up? Or was he scared that he would never climb again? Treating his cancer came with serious side effects that could leave Alexander feeling a weakness far deeper than any he'd ever felt, even in the death zone. For the next 2 years, Alexander kept a low profile and focused on getting better. He had to learn to take things slow and easy. On the days when the pain got unbearable, Alexander's wife, Nina, was always by his side. Together, they continued to build their family and even welcomed their second child in 2024. They also continued to advocate for the leukemia patients at the hospital. Being away from what you love doing can be really hard, and that must have been how Alexander felt. He needed to be back in the mountains, feeling the cold wind blow on his face. So as soon as his doctors cleared him for travel, Alexander already knew where he was going. After all, he had 2 years to think about it. He didn't go back to Everest or Denali or to any mountain he had already climbed in the past. He didn't even try to climb the extremely dangerous K2. Instead, he chose the fifth highest mountain in the world, Makalu. At 27,838 feet, Makalu is known as one of the most technically challenging mountains that a climber could attempt. It's shaped like a pyramid and has slopes so steep that one mistake could end a climber's life. But Alexander was an experienced climber. He had done more dangerous expeditions in the past, except this time, he wasn't as healthy as he used to be. However, Alexander's doctors made sure to confirm that every part of his body could handle extreme altitude and stress. Once cleared, he began to prepare, leaving nothing to chance, and in April 2025, Alexander approached Makalu like a man reuniting with his love. When climbers are about to attempt high-altitude mountains, they go through acclimatization schedules. This is when climbers ascend to higher camps so their bodies adjust to the lack of oxygen, then descend back to a lower camp to rest. Now, most climbers who have completed the Explorer's Grand Slam might feel confident enough to skip acclimatization, but Alexander didn't try to skip any step. Perhaps he knew what was at stake and reminded himself that he had to make it back home to his family. Slowly, he made his rotations to Camp 1, then Camp 2, and finally, Alexander had climbed 23,600 feet above sea level and was at Camp 3. On Makalu, acclimatization ends at Camp 3, and from there, the summit push begins. But Alexander knew he had to descend back to Camp 2 to rest well before the final summit push. He was being careful, even though by then, his body had already done the hardest part. For a man who once couldn't walk without feeling tired, reaching Camp 3 was proof that he could still move beyond the limits illness had drawn. He was conquering the mountain within, one step at a time. Once he was back at his tent at Camp 2, Alexander called his wife to keep her updated. He sounded calm and ready for what was next. A short overnight rest before the summit push. Everything was in order. Until it wasn't. Alexander was sharing the camp with other climbers from his expedition team. They had all descended from Camp 3 together earlier that day. They had dinner and checked their gear to make sure they were fully set for the summit push. But as they all prepared their sleeping bags to call it a night, someone fell to the ground. It was Alexander. At first, they were confused and probably thought he had crashed into something. But when they got closer to him, that confusion turned into alarm. Alexander was going into cardiac arrest. Above 21,000 feet, the human body is always negotiating and micromanaging the available resources. Even at rest, the heart works harder, beating faster to make up for what the air can't provide. Cardiac arrests happen when the heart's electrical system suddenly breaks down, causing it to stop beating. This prevents blood from reaching the brain and other important organs, leading to a person collapsing, losing consciousness, and ceasing to breathe or gasp for air. Now, cardiac arrests can be very dangerous when they happen outside a hospital setting. They could lead to brain injury and eventual death. Obviously, Makalu's Camp 2 was nowhere near a hospital. Alexander needed immediate cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, and a defibrillator. Luckily, some of his team members knew how to do CPR. They took turns for over an hour, applying oxygen masks while counting compressions. Alexander had so much to live for, and his teammates had to make sure he made it back home. But the CPR stopped, and the tent went quiet. It was the evening of Sunday, May 4th, 2025, at Camp 2 on Makalu, and 39-year-old Alexander Pancoe had survived a brain tumor and the death zone of Everest and passed away from cardiac arrest. With how sudden and quick cardiac arrests happen, it's unlikely that Alexander got a few moments to even think about his family. But I hope that when he had called his wife earlier, he got the slightest chance to say his goodbyes. Even though he died so young, Alexander accomplished a lot and gave many young people a chance to live a long life. He was a real-life Superman, and when his children are grown, I hope they learn all about their father's accomplishments. Alexander Pancoe's story doesn't end on a mountainside in Nepal. It lives on in every dollar raised for the hospital that saved him. In the legacy of a man who stared down death, not with fear, but with a relentless forward drive. He taught us that even when the body isn't made of rock, the human spirit is able to endure and conquer any mountain. What do you think about Alexander Pancoe's story? Let me know in the comments section. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.